In this episode of Middle East Files, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, an insight into how this global campaign has put economic and political pressure on the usurper regime of Israel. Has the international movement posed a threat to Israel? What are the milestones of BDS achievements in the past years? Isolation of the apartheid regime of Israel. In this edition of Middle East Files.
Welcome back to this episode of Middle East Files. This week's episode will give you a look at the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign. In 2005, 170 Palestinian civil society associations sent out a call to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israeli apartheid, in the same way the South African apartheid regime was treated on the international scene. The goal is to pressure Israel to comply with three demands: the end of Israeli occupation and colonization of Arab lands, full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens living within the Green Line, and respect the right of Palestinian refugees to return home. In June 1959, a group of South African exiles launched the boycott movement against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Over the years, the movement contributed to getting South Africa kicked out of the British Commonwealth. Also, the United Nations General Assembly called for economic sanctions. An academic boycott emerged in the 1960s, while the International Olympic Committee expelled South Africa in 1970. The US and UK, however, were the most hesitant countries to enforce trade sanctions against the apartheid regime. They were only eclipsed by Israel, which in 1975 signed an economic and military collaboration agreement with South Africa. The international isolation of the apartheid regime eventually helped bring it down in 1994. The Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions, BDS, against Israel was launched in July 2005. Over 170 Palestinian organizations endorsed BDS. They represent the refugees in exile, Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and those living inside the Green Line. In 2007, the Palestinian BDS National Committee was established to coordinate the growing global movement. BDS campaigners have pushed for the boycott of Israeli products in international markets. They also called on artists and academics to boycott the Zionist entity. Companies that profit from Israel's occupation of Palestine are targeted for divestment. The worst offenders are multinational corporations like G4S, which builds Israel's prisons and checkpoints. Others include Boeing and Lockheed Martin, which manufacture the weapons the Israeli military uses in wars, and Caterpillar, whose machinery is used to demolish Palestinian homes. Finally, sanctions are the last step in the isolation of the apartheid regime of Israel. Many states and global institutes have a history backing colonialism in the Middle East. It has been less than a decade since the initial call of Palestinian BDS movement. Today, the global reach of the campaign resembles that of the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa. But will it conclude with the same results? Discussing our first file even further, which is a comparison between South Africa and Palestine, is Mr. Ma'in Bashir, and he is the president of the Arab International Center of Communications and Solidarity. Do you think this boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign could possibly give back the Palestinians their rights?
Of course it will help, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. I think what would give the Palestinians the rights is resistance, by all kinds of resistance. This boycott movement is a kind of resistance. It's an important kind of resistance, especially because its influence is on one of the pillars of this Zionist entity, that is the international support, the Western support to the Zionist movement. When this Zionist entity would lose this international support, especially the Western support, especially the popular Western support, the support of the media, the support of the civil society, then it's going to lose one of its main pillars. That's why it's an important but not sufficient.
And in your opinion, why is this campaign, why is boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign actually streaming up, if you want, in the West, but not really here in the Arab world? And you see maybe Arab leaders continuing to normalize ties with the occupiers. Why so, in your opinion, Mr. Ma'in?
I think I'm very sorry to see Europeans, Americans, calling for boycotting this entity, and to see Arab leaders and Arab officials trying to normalize the relations with the Zionist entity. This is because I think most of our rulers think that to stay in ruling their people, they should be supported by the American administration. And in order to be supported by the American administration, they know that Tel Aviv is the shortest road to have American support. I mean, support by the American administration. So they think by normalizing relations with the Zionist entity, by trying to end all kinds of boycotts to this entity, this would please the Israelis, and the Israelis would help them to the Americans, whom they consider they are the real supporters for them in the regimes.
Israel has time and again placed fighting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign as one of its main jobs. Many believe Israel does so not just because of international isolation, but because it feels threatened. University campuses like this one in Beirut have raised awareness against Israeli apartheid. However, Israel has tried to turn the tables on BDS activists and label them as anti-Semitic. The colonization of Palestine took place with the use of military force and a global PR machine. This is how Israel manages to be. However, over the years, the military resistance against Israeli occupation developed. Resistant victories in Lebanon and Gaza eroded the image of Israel's army. Today, not only does Israel feel threatened by the growing armed resistance, the fear of international delegitimization has also gripped the Zionist entity. In 2011, the Israeli Knesset passed an anti-boycott law. In the United States, anti-boycott legislation was introduced this year in both New York and Maryland to punish institutes that endorsed the boycott. It was, however, withdrawn after criticism that it was an attack on freedom of expression. In March 2014, the United States House of Representatives introduced an act that would deny funding to any institution that endorses the academic boycott of Israel. In the same vein, pro-Palestinian students groups have been fought on U.S. campuses. This year, Northeastern University banned the pro-BDS students for justice in Palestine. Israel has interfered directly in student voting on many campuses. Most recently, the Israeli consulate in Chicago was actively campaigning against BDS at DePaul University. Despite Israel's effort, the student body there voted in favor of divestment. Another tactic by Israel to intimidate boycott campaigners is to accuse them of anti-Semitism. Even Nobel Peace Prize winning Desmond Tutu was not immune from accusations by Israel. The South African Archbishop had called Israeli discrimination quote-unquote apartheid and called for divestment from companies that profit from the occupation and subjugation of Palestinians. Recently, Zionist media has started celebrating what they see as victories against BDS. The concert promoter for the Rolling Stones Tel Aviv show said, "These days, it can't be taken for granted that a band of this magnitude will come to Israel. Even when little-known cultural figures visit Israel, they are greeted with welcoming articles in Israeli press." This can only be a sign of Israel losing the war for legitimacy. Shedding more light on our second file, which is Israel feeling threatened, is Dr. Vijay Prashad, and he is the Edward Said Chair at the American University of Beirut, as well as advisory board of the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Dr. Vijay, has the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement maybe isolated Israel, especially within the international arena? We see Israel feeling threatened, feeling isolated due to this movement. What are your comments here?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't think the boycott movement has isolated Israel. I think Israeli policy has isolated Israel. You know, at every stage of the last 2 years, Israel has flouted international law. Israel has moved to build more settlements. Israel has violated a number of, nominal obligations that it's made to the international community. What the boycott campaign has enabled is to shed light on Israel's self-isolation, its disregard for international law. And I think the important issue here is, previously, when Israel violated international law, it was left to the media and to some small sections of the public around the world to try to say there's something wrong going on, in Palestine. Now, ordinary people have something they can do to get involved in not only shedding light on Israeli policy against the Palestinians, but also they feel like they're doing something to contribute to the Palestinian cause. In the United States, which is the major international defender of the state of Israel, the BDS campaign has to simply put on the table the fact of Israeli illegality, which in Europe is already established. European countries accept that Israeli policy is illegal. In America, Israeli policy is not even seen as illegal. So it's very important for the BDS campaign to raise awareness among the population, to give this opinion, the view of how Israel has indeed violated policy, and therefore what can you do about it. And the BDS campaign is well positioned to do this because it's open to asking questions of not only Israeli policy, but how the United States is implicated in what Israel is doing.
And Dr. Vijay, do you believe that the BDS will have maybe the same results or the same effects that the South African anti-apartheid movement had?
This is not a question for me to answer. Recently, the last apartheid president of South Africa, Mr. de Klerk, was in Israel, where he gave a speech, and then he was asked by Israeli television, do you think Israel is an apartheid state? And Mr. de Klerk said, well, I don't think it's an apartheid state now, but it's certainly on the road to becoming an apartheid state. In other words, if the last apartheid president of South Africa recognizes the signs of apartheid in Israel, who am I to say Israel is apartheid? More qualified people who know apartheid in and out. For instance, the guy who ran the apartheid state says that this is apartheid virtually. So we know that it is very much like South Africa. Now the question is, can the BDS movement have impact on Israel that the anti-apartheid movement had on South Africa? There is one very big difference. And the huge difference is the United States government, which was committed to apartheid era South Africa, did not have inside the United States a large enough constituency that was fighting tooth and nail to defend apartheid South Africa. Meaning there was no group, no lobby that was sufficiently powerful in the United States that came to South Africa's defense in the last years of apartheid. Israel has a huge advantage. It has a very substantial lobby inside the United States. And one section of that lobby is the evangelical Christian population that believes, bizarrely, that the Jews have to build the temple in Jerusalem and then the prophet, the Messiah will come back and all Jews will be killed. I mean, their views, the evangelical Christian views, is actually deeply anti-Semitic. But they are the greatest defenders of Israel in America. So this kind of lobby was not there for South Africa, which means that the same result as accrued for South Africa will not be there for Israel.
The Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement has been successful in isolating Israel. The campaign has gained momentum in places like the United States and Europe. Ironically, though, Arab nations have largely been absent, as some Arab leaders continue to normalize ties with the occupiers. Here in South Lebanon, Israel has created an apartheid-like wall on the Lebanese borders. Lebanese view this wall as a sign of Israeli weakness. With Israel continuing to show aggressions, the question is being raised, will Israel ever reach this tipping point where governments will turn against the apartheid regime? In December 2013, the 5,000-member American Studies Association voted 2-1 to endorse the boycott of apartheid Israel. The pro-Israel New York Times wrote that this move signaled that the boycott movement has begun to make strides in the United States. While the academic boycott has only recently started to make an impact in Israel's staunchest ally, it is becoming mainstream on European campuses. Israeli Apartheid Week, commemorated on university campuses in March of each year, has grown every year since 2004. In 2014, 154 cities across the globe marked Israeli Apartheid Week. The Arab countries, however, remained largely absent as authoritarian regimes moved towards normalizing relations with occupiers. In an article published in February, The Economist said Israeli politicians were rattled by the campaign to isolate their country. Israel is approaching the same tipping point where South Africa found itself in opposition to the rest of the world in the dying days of apartheid. This was a quote from Israel's finance minister, Yair Lapid. The BDS movement's news feeds highlights BDS activities that spans the globe, from Finland in the north to Argentina in the south. Legendary American activist Grace Lee Boggs refused to have a film about her life screened at a festival in Tel Aviv. The 98-year-old philosopher and the film producer Danny Glover issued a statement where they said, "We stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine and support their call for cultural and academic boycott of Israel." Since BDS has been successful, the question remaining is, when will it reach the tipping point in which governments will be too embarrassed to deal with the apartheid regime? Shedding more light on the milestones BDS has achieved is Dr. Rania Masri, and she is a longtime BDS organizer in the United States and Lebanon. Dr. Rania, I want to begin with, in your opinion, with so many powerful friends, why is Israel so scared of this BDS movement?
Well, I think it speaks to the achievements and the strength of BDS, that we've finally gotten the Israeli government and those that support the Israeli system to actually take notice of us. So that speaks volumes as to the level of organization and the solidarity that has been shown by the international BDS movement. Specifically, to answer your question, what makes BDS very powerful is it targets the legitimacy of the State of Israel. It targets the very core, because BDS argues that, one, if Israel is an apartheid state, which Israel is, then therefore we cannot normalize relationships with such an abnormal entity. So it targets the heart of the State of Israel, because the State of Israel has been created and continues to be created on the values of ethnic cleansing, ethnic supremacy, and apartheid. And these are the very things that BDS targets, specifically the idea of racism and apartheid. And so yes, BDS specifically targets the legitimacy of Israel, and in that sense, Israel is scared by it.
Dr. Rania, you have been a longtime activist in BDS, so if you could please comment about the milestones this campaign has achieved over the past years, and at the same time, in your opinion, do you believe this campaign has been successful?
Yes. Let me just say it up front. Yes, this campaign not only has been successful, it has been inspirational. It has been empowering. It has offered us the rationale to say we are winning, and we do see the light now where the end of apartheid is coming. And I say that very logically. Yes, most definitely we are succeeding. As to the milestones, just over the past 10 to 15 years, we've managed to shift the discourse. We've managed to change the narrative, which is essential. So now, rather than organizers being limited to a discourse of anti-occupation, being limited to only talking about the occupied territory, and specifically that usually is limited to the West Bank and Gaza, now we are much more expansive. Now we're able to talk about apartheid. Now we're able to talk about the right of return. We're able to talk about discrimination, ethnic supremacy. Consequently, BDS has then grown from being focused only on economic boycott of goods from the settlements, from the Israeli settlements in the occupied territory, which is how it began, to now being very strong as an academic boycott and a cultural boycott. And it is here, as an academic and cultural boycott, that the State of Israel is most frightened of us.
What's more important to focus on, in your opinion? Is it a global BDS movement, or one that focuses on Israel's apartheid empowering allies, if you want?
What the BDS movement allows activists and organizers to do is to build solidarity. So we connect issues, and that connecting of issues together becomes critical. So, for example, we boycott Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola has built has built facilities in land in occupied Palestine, in Palestine 1948, the historic Palestine, that was built on the destroyed Palestinian villages. Now, by boycotting Coca-Cola because it is a prime supporter of apartheid Israel and a prime supporter of cultural events in Israel, on and on and on, we can also link with activists in India that are boycotting Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola is stealing their waters. And that becomes the strength of solidarity. And that is, I think, what is critical about BDS is it's not issue-oriented. We're not asking people, come support us out of love for Palestine. Come stand with us because we are Palestinians and we want you to support us. No. Come support us out of love for justice. Come support us out of love for equality. Come support us out of rejection for racism and rejection of apartheid. So once we're on that platform, then wherever we have a struggle for justice, wherever we are fighting against racism, the connection is there. And that is the meaning of solidarity.
It has been less than a decade since the initial call of the Palestinian BDS movement was made, and it has achieved significant milestones in isolating the Israeli Apartheid regime. The snowball effect that this movement has gathered in the past has without a doubt left many to believe the isolation of Israel will continue to grow rapidly. What has raised fears in Israel is that this boycott campaign may achieve the same results it had against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Thanks so much for staying with me on this episode of Middle East Files. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.